Hi, welcome to our land use lecture. Today we're going to talk about human agriculture and the impacts that human agriculture have had on the habitable earth, and a little bit about agricultural techniques that we can use to create less damage to the earth. So we've been harvesting plants and growing plants in a way that benefits us for food, for sustenance, for about 10,000 years, which is not very long if you really think about it. So 10,000 years ago, humankind underwent an agricultural revolution. So before this time, people were actually pretty nomadic, and we moved around. We followed food as it moved with the seasons. And at some point, we figured out that, or our ancestors figured out, that we could actually plant the plants that we wanted, and we affected how they grew using natural selection techniques, human-directed natural selection, right? So humans directed the evolution of certain plants, such as grains, so that they grew in a way that benefited us more, and that they were, better sustenance for us. So since then, we've really expanded our agricultural abilities, obviously, here on Earth. What percent of land do we use for agriculture? Do you know the answer to that? Hopefully you will by the end of this module. So modern techniques for agriculture are extremely industrialized and utilize a lot of technology to harvest these plants. We are going to talk a little bit about genetic modification in a subsequent lecture, so I hope that you are looking forward to that. And here's the answer to that question. So 40% of the land on Earth, so that is anything that is not ocean, is dedicated to agriculture. And this, of course, is going to have an impact on our ecosystems and our CO2 cycles, for example, among other things. And you can think about, as we go on in the lecture, how agriculture impacts our life on Earth. Proper agricultural techniques are critical for us to preserve the land and have it be able to continuously be providing agricultural output for us. So when humans use techniques for agriculture that do not allow for sustainable habits, we actually lose the ability to culture plants on that portion of land. So in 1937, we underwent a huge disaster here in the United States called the Dust Bowl, and this was due to improper farming techniques. So you might imagine, as you can see in this previous picture, that a lot of land that was untouched before humans arrived and started altering it to allow them to grow plants was this land probably has some trees and some various vegetation and some ecosystems going on already in it. And what you see when we look at these big expanses of agriculture is that we've removed a lot of the vegetation that is normally there, of course, and we are putting in our own plants that we want to eat and grow, or we want to feed to cows, for example, and eat the cows. And what this creates is instead of all of that soil being held down by the trees and plants that are normally there or naturally there, instead we have at times a huge expanse of dirt that can actually fly away because there's nothing really to hold it down. So erosion and just dust bowls, like the dust bowl that is described here, can happen due to the fact that any vegetation has been removed from that land, and other bad farming techniques that can lead to this condition. So in 1937, we had the people that were living then experienced these dust bowls, and this was when fertile topsoil flew away because there was a drought, so it was very dry, so wind carried it up, and a lot of people had to abandon their homes and their lands. And Franklin D. Roosevelt considered this just a national crisis, and said the words, "The nation that destroys its soil destroys itself." So I hope that's an impetus for you to consider why these proper farming techniques are so important. Farmland obviously is critical for us. It provides us the food that we eat. When we grow plants on Earth that was previously just had wild plants living on it, we cause mineral depletion from the soil. We can cause chemical contamination by fertilization and by other means, or spraying with pesticides. We can change the acidity of the soil, the salinity of the soil, etc. And we can also affect the water flows through that area, the water cycle in that area. By improving our farming techniques, we can have improved nutrition in the plants that we are actually growing. When we talk about the land that we are growing our plants on, this land is an ecosystem, a very, very complex ecosystem that existed long before we came along. And the continued maintenance of this ecosystem is really important for us to be able to continue using this land for the purpose of growing the food that we eat. And here's a little nice picture of the ecosystem that exists underground. Soil is a living, finite resource, so that means that we can, in fact, use it up, and that doesn't mean just using up the space that we have available. It also means that once we destroy a plot of land that used to be able to grow plants in a very robust way, if we deplete the nutrients there and we affect the ecosystems, that plant is not going to be able to sustain agriculture anymore. So it is a finite resource in that sense. Plants obtain most of their minerals from that upper layer. So we've talked a little bit about this in the past. We've talked about fertilization and how we need to supply plants with nutrients sometimes. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in this lecture. And living organisms such as worms, and here you have a little mole in the ground there, are really important for contributing nutrients to the plants that we actually eat. So maintaining this ecosystem is important for us to be able to successfully harvest plants. This ecosystem is fragile. Soil is stratified into different layers. So we can call these horizons, and the top layer has a lot of nutrients typically. So this is because the top layer has plants, so we can see in this picture here that there's grass on top, and when some of those grass blades die, they will fall into the earth and decompose, and microorganisms as well as macroorganisms are going to decompose this plant, and they are going to contribute these nutrients back to the earth when through various methods of decomposition. So that topsoil is very fertile. So it has a lot of decaying organic material and humus, as it is amusingly called. When rainfall hits earth, so when rainfall hits soil, rain is going to be attracted to some elements of soil, so there is a lot of positive and negative charges going on. So positive and negative charges will be attracted to each other, and rain will stay in some areas because of that attraction of the rainwater to the soil itself. Most of the rain will filter down through the soil and hit water basins underground, or any kind of water storage underground. So this is actually a good thing. We don't want water accumulating too much in the soil. This is going to choke the roots and not allow them to take in various things that the plant needs to live. So we talked about humus, which is this very fertile topsoil that has a lot of decaying plant matter and decomposition. And so because of all this decomposition and because of the nature of the soil in that top layer, that layer can actually retain water, which is really great for plants. And for various other reasons, the ions, so the charged particles that are in that soil, allow plants to actually remove minerals from the soil and take them up. So that it's really important. Those charged particles are really important for plants to take up nutrition from the soil. Worms, such as the one in the picture there, bacteria, fungus or fungi, algae, any other single-cell organisms, insects, earthworms, other kinds of worms called nematodes, roots, these are all organic components of soil. So there's a thriving, rich ecosystem there underground. All of these organisms help decompose the organic material and mix the soil up, so they also introduce a lot of aeration and make sure that the earth is not too compact. And this is really important for plants to be happy in that top layer. Let's talk a little bit about microbes. We know that decomposition is performed by worms, but microbes are actually, by biomass, perform a lot more decomposition than any larger organism. These microbes that are degrading material underground actually have a mutually symbiotic relationship with plants. So when we think about symbiosis, we're thinking about two elements that are helping each other, right? So in this case, the microbes are providing a service for the plants. They are providing nutrients for the plants. And the plant roots will in turn actually provide something back for the microbes. So maybe the microbes can live very close or within the roots and will benefit from sugars that the plant supplies that they can eat as well. This complex ecosystem of microbes, meaning bacteria, and all of these other organisms and plant roots, we can call the rhizosphere. So we're going to talk about where that name came from in a minute. The rhizosphere is, when we look through those magnifying glasses down there, we can see all of these single-cell organisms, all of these tiny organisms, and they are all in close proximity to the roots. So this is a very, very small ecosystem that is critically important for plants to do well and grow and thrive. This rhizosphere has high microbial activity because of this mutually symbiotic relationship that we are talking about, where the roots are secreting sugars and amino acids, which are part of proteins, for the bacteria, and the bacteria are taking them up, and they are in turn providing something to the roots of these plants so that they can grow better. You might want to think back at this point to an element related to this that we've learned previously. This is a question for you, what might these microbes be supplying the plants specifically? Do you recall our nutrient cycling lecture where we discussed nitrogen fixation? So think about that. We're going to talk about that now. So these bacteria some of them live within the soil and live very close to the roots and benefit from those roots excreting sugars and amino acids. Some of these microbes actually live within the roots themselves, so they will infiltrate the root of the plant and live there, directly benefiting from the nutrients that the plant supplies. These can be bacteria or fungi. A lot of different microorganisms live around or in the roots themselves. These bacteria can secrete hormones that will stimulate plant growth, for example. So that is one way in which we can define the mutually symbiotic relationship. These microorganisms can provide antibiotics that will actually protect the plant from negative microbes or negative bacteria that are not mutually symbiotic and that are actually preying on the plant in some way. These bacteria can also absorb toxic chemicals, for example. So here's a nice kind of simplified diagram of this mutually symbiotic relationship. So in this nice cartoon, we're calling these microbes that are interacting positively with the plant growth promoting rhizobacteria. And we see down there in the blue picture, we see PGPR, which is how it's abbreviated. And they're showing you that there's a lot of complex interactions happening here. So these PGPRs are contributing positively to the plant roots, and they're also providing antibiotics which will protect the plant against other pathogens which might actually harm the plant. There's a lot of interesting research on this area because people do want to know more about how we can harvest plants more efficiently and how we can get plants and agriculture to grow more robustly. And this lab where the lab head is Dr. Morikawa, is showing in this picture here that if you inoculate seeds, so if you take seeds of let's say a wheat plant or a rice plant, and you inoculate those seeds with a rhizobacteria that is going to benefit the plant once the plant grows, you will observe increased crop yields. And they're showing you in two different kinds of pictures here, the rhizobacteria living right on the plant root. So on the left we have a fluorescence picture, so it's a microscope picture, and we're looking really, really close up. And in green they are showing you a picture of the rhizobacteria, and red is the plant root. It's not the clearest of pictures, but on the right we do see this is a scanning electron microscope picture. So we know it's scanning electron microscope because the scanning gives you that 3D looking appearance. And we see that there are a lot of bacteria growing on that plant root. So we can actually increase our crop yields by inoculating our plants with bacteria. What are these bacteria actually contributing to the plants? So we did cover nitrogen fixation briefly in our nutrient cycling lecture, and we know that nitrogen is critical for plants, very, very important. So plants require nitrogen and require actually good amounts of it. Now, nitrogen can be a limiting nutrient, and we learned about that too. So that means that if nitrogen is not readily available, plants will be stunted in their growth, or they won't be able to grow unless they have a larger dose of nitrogen available. We also know, or you might recall, that nitrogen exists in the atmosphere in the form of N2. And plants cannot actually take up nitrogen in that form. So here's the blue bubble showing you N2 from the atmosphere. Now, how does the plant actually get that nitrogen from the atmosphere or from sources that are in the ground into the plant so that the plant can grow and become bigger? So bacteria come in, nitrogen-fixing bacteria come in, and actually provide that service for the plant. So bacteria which can nitrogen fix, shown here in pink, these nitrogen-fixing bacteria, are going to convert that atmospheric nitrogen, N2, to ammonia, and then that will be converted into ammonium, and that goes into nitrate, and plants can take up that nitrate and utilize nitrogen in that form to incorporate it into their biological molecules. So nitrogen fixation is a critically important function that these rhizosphere bacteria provide. Most of the nitrogen that plants take up is provided by these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. We mentioned that some of the bacteria live on the outside of the root, like we saw in the previous image. And conversely, and interestingly, some bacteria actually live within the root of the plant itself. And a lot of legumes, so soybeans, pea plants, peanuts, these all have actually nitrogen-fixing bacteria living within the roots themselves. So these nodules that you see here on the left are actually nodules that are full of these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Now, hopefully this is bringing back some ideas that we've already touched upon, where we talked about crop rotation, where we introduce these legumes to introduce more nitrogen into the earth, and also you might recall the reading that you did on pea plants and how we can decrease our environmental impact by growing pea plants for the sake of producing gin instead of a grain. So that's a photograph on the left of these rhizobium bacteria. So when you think about rhizosphere, which is that area around the root and that ecosystem that exists between bacteria and the plant roots, the bacteria we can call in this case rhizobium bacteria. And on the right here we have a electron microscope image. It's not scanning, so that's why it doesn't look 3D. We've actually just sliced the root with a knife, and we're looking at that cross section of the root. It's difficult to interpret these pictures unless you're used to looking at them, but suffice it to say that they're showing you that there's a bacteria cell and it's within the confines of the root of the plant. So these bacteria are actually inside the cell wall of the plant. Every kind of legume is associated with its own strain of rhizobium. Again, what is the symbiotic relationship here? The plants are gaining this nitrogen fixation ability of the rhizobium, and the bacteria are benefiting by being actually encased by the root of the plant. They are thriving off of the sugars and proteins that the plant is providing, and they are also protected in some way. So there's a huge evolutionary advantage to both of these species to cohabitate. Crop rotation, just as a review, is takes advantage of the agricultural benefits of these nitrogen fixing bacteria that live within legumes such as peanuts or pea protein or other examples like that. So what is crop rotation? Say we want to grow a field of wheat and we grow the wheat. Nitrogen is depleted from the earth, right, because the plants take up the nitrogen that is available there. That process depletes the nitrogen that's available in the earth in the form that plants can take up. And if you plant wheat again the next year, you might not have such a good crop because the nutrient is limiting and it's not going to be available for the plants there. So what do you do as a intelligent, sustainable farmer? You might say, well, I'm going to grow peanuts this next year. And the peanuts, I know, have those rhizobium bacteria that are embedded in their roots, and those bacteria are going to convert atmospheric nitrogen to ammonium and nitrate that plants can actually take up. So they're going to fortify the earth with more nitrate that when I plant something next year, again, something different, all that nitrate is going to be available for the plants to take up. Now, once you harvest these peanuts, let's say, if those are that's the crop rotation you choose to do, instead of harvesting them, you could even just mix up all the dirt and all the plants there and just put all of that organic material back into the ground with all of those nitrogen fixing bacteria and all of that nitrogen that's already been fixed, and the next year you're going to have a very fertile land to grow off of. So that is one alternative to mass fertilization, which results in a lot of the negative impacts that we've discussed much earlier in the course. Let's discuss a couple other ways in which we can perform agriculture in a sustainable way. I mentioned in the very beginning of the lecture that the Dust Bowl that occurred in 1937 and actually lasted for kind of some time occurred because there was a drought, so everything was very dry, and the land had no cover. There were no plants planted in the earth, so all of that soil was just dry and loose. And when the storms came and the wind blew, all of that created these massive dust clouds. To prevent that kind of erosion, we can use various farming methods that promote conservation and are environmentally safe and profitable. One example of that is creating fields that look kind of like this. So instead of having a flat field, you create these layers, these different steps, and this controls erosion of the land, especially when it's not flat. So this is going to prevent erosion due to water and wind. So that's one way to control erosion. For example, there's other ways in which we can improve our agriculture techniques. and be more sustainable. So one way is by improving our irrigation. Watering out all of these agricultural endeavors requires a lot of water, and there are a lot of ways in which we can reduce the amount of water that we need to get the same crop yield. One point is that here in California and also in other places in the United States, the primary source of water is from aquifers. And what happens is all of this water is stored underground. And when we take that water out too quickly and we don't allow it to recover and replenish, we create sinkholes. So you can see that sinkhole on the right, that massive sinkhole that was created because we took all of that water out of the out of that underground aquifer too quickly. And on the left there, they're showing you that something similar happened. It's not quite a sinkhole, but the entire land is dropping because of water being removed from underground resources. Water is also a critical resource, of course, that we need on Earth, and we can also consider it finite and irreplaceable. If we use up all the fresh water that we have on Earth, processes to desalinate salt water, for example, or recovers fresh water in other ways are going to be extremely expensive, and that's going to have a huge impact on us if we don't have access to fresh water anymore. So drip irrigation, shown here, is one way in which we can minimize the amount of water that we need to grow the same crop yield. We talked about fertilization in previous lectures. We talked about nitrogen fixation in this lecture. We are bringing up these ideas of limiting nutrients and that plants require nutrients. I think this is a concept that you are familiar with by now, and if you're not, you can go back to some of the earlier lectures and review that. Here are some of the nutrients that plants require. So nitrogen is up there, right, number 4 from the top. 1.5% of the plant is nitrogen. If we dry out the plant and just see what all the different elements are, 45% of the plant is carbon. So when we say we are a carbon-based life, here's the proof. So if you take a plant, dry it out, and separate it into elements, 45% of those elements are carbon. So we are indeed a carbon-based life. There are other nutrients that are required in much smaller amounts, but they're still essential. So we do need iron, but we just don't need very much of it. But it is also critical. And of course, these nutrients are going to be limiting, which you know means that in small amounts of them, if they are available in only small amounts, that plant is not going to grow very robustly. So for example, here's an experiment showing you 2 plants that are grown hydroponically. And the plant on the right is grown without potassium, and we can see in the cartoon that it's stunted and it's not quite as healthy as the other plant. I think they're trying to show you that the leaves are also a little bit yellow, which is often a symptom of nutrient deficiency. So here is a healthy plant on top, and they're showing you that different nutrient deficiencies can be recorded by us investigators in different ways by looking at how the plant looks. So another way that humans have combated these issues is by fertilization. So over-fertilization results in a lot of the issues that, again, we've talked about previously. So for example, algal blooms. If you recall, and you had a whole SymBio module about this, where I think all of you did pretty well in recalling what the consequence of over fertilization was. Even just reducing the amount of forests that are on Earth and replacing them with agriculture has an impact on our environment. So we have learned a lot about carbon dioxide cycling by now. We know that these forests are important for taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And we also know that deforestation is going to have an impact on the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So a lot of deforestation happens for the purpose of clearing land for agriculture, clearing land for growing feed for meat, so for livestock. And here is a somewhat recent graph showing you the rates of deforestation in 3 different parts of the world that have pretty substantial percents of the forests on. There's a tremendous percentage of forests that are present in the Amazon and in the Congo and in Southeast Asia, and we can see all of these locations have had an increase in deforestation over the last 30 or 40 or 50 years. So hopefully that's something that we can stave off and maintain the forests that we have the way they are in the condition that they are in. Here's another review of a concept. So all of these concepts that we've studied already are coming back over and over and over again because these are just fundamental ideas that we need to understand how human behavior impacts the ecosystem. When we talk about different trophic levels and transfer of energy between these different trophic levels, we've reiterated over and over again that the percent of energy that can transfer from one level to the next is only 10%. So this is why it takes a lot more land to produce a pound of livestock, so a pound of meat, versus a pound of plant to eat. And we can even consider the amount of protein that is yielded from that amount of land and do a direct comparison of the protein that we can get from beans, for example, so way down there on the bottom, versus the amount of protein that we can get from beef, and how much land does it take to produce the same amount of protein. And in this case they're looking at a gram of protein. So for beef you actually require almost 100 times more land because of that highly inefficient trophic transfer of energy. And in general, these extremely large animals are pretty inefficient. Similarly, we can look at the same kind of data just presented in the reverse manner. So how much protein can we get per acre? So previously we saw amount of land required to produce 1 gram of protein. This is how much protein you can get out of the same area of land. And we can see soybeans, you can get 356 pounds of protein, and livestock like beef, you can get 20 pounds. Hopefully that's given you something to think about. That is our lecture on land use, and thank you so much for listening.